For those of you who are your first time and here, then I just want to tell you that we always start with music.
We just had the most amazing family vacation. Let's go! Oh my God.
Nothing says vacation like going with children.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so I'm going to switch over here really quickly. And we're going to look at just one more reminder for those of you who have not yet got on Cengage. It's critical that you do. 10% of your grade comes from here. The questions for your exam, some of the, about 50–60% come from here. 50%, I think is probably right. The way that you enter it, the only way that you can enter it is through Canvas. You click here under modules, start here, Cengage textbook and exercises. It opens up here. You click this. It has you do a registration page here, and then scroll down and select free trial. You have until midnight on Sunday left on your free trial. So for those of you too who are doing the free trial and you want to make sure you get those chapters 2 and 3 in, which are due on Monday, right? Then be sure to do them before midnight on Sunday and you lose your free trial, okay? The main idea questions for each day, 4 and 5 are also open if you're afraid you're not going to have the money to pay. The main idea questions for each day are again also under modules, and they are under the week. And so this is week 2. Here's our lecture for today, and here's our questions for today. So here under module for week 2, we have our lecture with the PowerPoints, and we also have the questions. After lectures, Eric has been so great as to post the Zoom lectures up here, which is fantastic. And so they are always here on the home page. I'm in the wrong place. They're here on the homepage, class recordings, and this is the link right here that is always there for the YouTube playlist for Zoom lectures. So I am going to get to the lecture now. And we're going to talk about important things like limited government. And in particular, what I want to talk about is a few different things, but first, we're going to kind of sum up some of the key things that we talked about over the last couple of days. So for those of you who are just joining into the class, the questions are there under week 2. And so they are meant to focus. Like I said, about 50% of your tests come from those, the chapters you're reading in Cengage, and also the exercises you're doing. The other 50% come from lecture. And so in lecture, we are going to talk about lots of different things, but those questions focus you about what we might have a multiple choice question about or a short answer question about. We had a poll in class on Monday about whether you're a Federalist or an anti-Federalist. Most of you were more likely to be a Federalist than an anti-Federalist. And so that was about, 67% of you tended toward federalism, and about 34% tended toward anti-federalism. That's pretty standard. We get about 65 to 70 Federalists and 30 to 35 anti-Federalists. So that's pretty usual. And this is important because we're still having debates about these things today. And so it's key. Your first question actually from today, from the directed questions, kind of focuses here on this slide. We have some real challenges in democracy, protecting individual rights and also ensuring that there is majority rule. These things are both essential to a democratic republic, and they are at loggerheads oftentimes. Individual rights include speech, assembly, publishing, criticizing government, the right to be free from search and seizure without a warrant, all sorts of things, right? majority rule means that the group with the most votes wins power over governing decisions. And whenever I'm talking about governing decisions, I'm talking about policies. So I'm talking about how much money we spend on infrastructure. Do we spend money on infrastructure? How do we roll out a COVID response, right? Or do we, right? Where does that happen at the national level, at the state level, those sort of things. So the group with the most votes wins power over those governing decisions. Majorities often trample individual rights, and well-organized minorities can subvert the majority will. And we'll talk about that a lot when we talk about the Senate, the Electoral College, the role of states generally in terms of their power at the federal level. But an important thing to remember is this: if we have unlimited liberties and no law, we often descend into anarchy. Remember that for Friday in your labs, you have workbook chapters 2 and 3 due, but you also need to read the Constitution. And one of the reasons you need to read it is because you're going to be thinking about how to form your own Constitution. I'm going to go ahead and take attendance right now, theoretically. And so I have started attendance. And it is active as of right now, okay? So attendance is live, it is active. We're gonna have a poll a little bit later on. The submission is open for workbooks on Canvas. I actually just fixed it today. So you should be able to fix that if that is what your lab leader wants. If that's what your lab instructor wants you to do, that is what you do. Okay, but your lab instructor gave you instructions last Friday about how they would like that. The workbook pages are posted. So attendance is going to show up. If it isn't showing up, let's see, let's make sure. Oh, that's because I'm in the wrong place. Look, I did it again. Hold on.
You want me to start it?
I got it.
Okay.
Sorry. I took attendance accidentally from the class at 11 o'clock this morning. They're going to be a little upset about that. They're going to say, wait, we weren't even in class. It doesn't make sense. But all right, it's going now. And it looks like 100 of you have already replied, so I know it's showing up. Remember, if you're having problems with your app, to refresh, because it's a really long time period. You still have a minute and a half, and so refreshing the app shouldn't be a problem. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. We obviously talked about it last Wednesday, but here's some key ideas from that, okay? All men are created equal, right? This idea that humans are equal, this is something that we have carried on, even though at the time, it obviously wasn't what most people believed. Governments are required through social contract to provide life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A reminder again, happiness is not, I feel really good. Happiness means that I am fulfilled. I have fulfilled my potential. And when you think about how crazy this idea is, Jefferson is saying it's the job of government to make sure we as individuals are able to be the best person that we can be. So that means that Luke is the best absolute Luke. He lives up to his potential, that Gavin does, that Bretland does, that Andrew does, that Eric does. This is basically who I'm seeing, right? So if you cannot get on attendance, there's 20 seconds left. It looks like there's about 40 of you who have not managed to get on. And so if you have not, but you are on Cengage, then right now in the chat, just simply say, I'm here, okay? And Eric will, I think, fix that. So I'm here if you were not able to do that. It looks like 3 or 5 of you, something like that, are here, okay? So in Letter from Birmingham Jail, we have some echoes of that. I am here because injustice is here. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We talked about the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a new founder. And we talk about that, how Abraham Lincoln echoes the Declaration of Independence, how Martin Luther King Jr. echoes the Declaration of Independence. But he also says some things, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that becomes such a part of our national identity. That George W. Bush, whenever entering into the war in Afghanistan, says injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Freedom is never given freely by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. And I want you guys to think about that. A lot of times, I think that we get a little bit, as a society, we push back against protest. We say, oh, it'll be fine, just be cool. But Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, hey, look, if you just hang out and wait for something to happen, the oppressor is never going to give up that power. You have to demand it. And justice that has been too long delayed is justice denied. If we're waiting 60 years for something to happen, then we're not getting justice. He also talks about the difference between just and unjust laws, right? He talks about how, and we didn't really talk about this very much. I think we got kind of at the end of our lecture on that day. But just laws, he talks about how we must absolutely recognize the law and use those just laws. But unjust laws, things that we perceive to be unjust, we have a duty to have peaceful, nonviolent protest to try to change them. And we'll talk a lot about nonviolent protest whenever we get to civil rights. When we compare the Constitution and the Declaration, we know that the Constitution, which was much more elitist, right? It doesn't have this egalitarian, all men are created equal in it. Absolutely, without question, the founders wanted the best to govern. The Senate, the presidency, and the judiciary were all either put in place by indirect election. We elected someone and then they elected them, or we elected somebody and then they appointed them. And when you think about the judiciary, the Senate was indirectly elected by state legislatures, and the president was indirectly elected by electors. And then the president nominated members of the judiciary, and the Senate confirmed, and the House, which was a direct election from us, right, had no say at all and continues to have no say. And so in terms of indirect election and then appointment, the judiciary was 3 times removed from we the people. Only the House was directly elected. Now, Madison, whenever he put together this Constitution, he saw there as being a branch that was the House, and it was directly elected. All of it, that Congress was made up of the House of Representatives. And we're going to talk about some of the compromises that changed that. It was certainly much less radical than the Declaration of Independence. So they wanted much more indirect consent filtered through representatives. It's going to emphasize stability, order, and slow change. And understand, it's emphasizing these things because between the times of the Articles of Confederation and the time that we do this, there's uprisings again and again, Shays' Rebellion being the biggest one of those. And whenever it comes to slow change, I told you guys this just on Monday, but I'm going to remind you. James Madison said, no law is better than a bad law. And so when we say, hey, it's inefficient, Madison's going to say, good, I want it to be. That's the way it should work. We want it to be hard to make laws that affect us all. When we talk about the framers' values, the Constitution reflects this limited government. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about limited government today, or Dr. Thomas Patterson is going to. The rule of law is key. We are not ruled by men or women. We are ruled by law. There's a separation of powers, but also there's a blending of powers. Protection and rights, both in the Constitution with the Bill of Rights and in the body of the Constitution, and by states. and then majority rule. There has to be consent of the governed. And so even with indirect elections, there's a way that people have accountability. That democratic accountability is key. There are quite a few compromises that are made in the Constitution. The Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise is going to shape state power. That decision, instead of one house in Congress, to have a bicameral Congress, the House representing the people, the Senate representing the states, mean the states have more power. The compromise over slavery is going to shape attitudes towards race to this very day. To this very day. The decision not to outlaw slavery, the decision not to count slaves as people. These decisions impact society today. The compromise regarding the executive from the election, the Electoral College is supposed to be elected by the people we trust in each state, and it's indirect, but that's very quickly co-opted by parties. But in either case, again, states end up with a little bit more balance of power than do the people. And then the powers of the presidency, it's unclear in terms of what the presidential limits are. And we'll talk about that. The fact that presidential power is going to expand over the next 200 years and the reason for that. A big constitutional compromise is they don't deal with political equality. And they don't deal with the right to vote. They leave it all up to the state. So in some states, women who were landowners over the age of 25 could vote until there's kind of this movement away from that where you had to be a male over the age of 25 and you did not have to own land. This was left up to the states. So this is another place where states had power in terms of determining political equality. When we think about Federalist and anti-Federalist debates then and now, we didn't quite get to this in the lecture on Monday, so I'm going to remind you about them. We still have debates about national power and state power. We still have debates over whether a large and diverse nation is necessary to preserve our liberty and rights, versus the idea that an extended government leads to an end of liberty and self-government, in part because we're defining liberty in different ways. We continue to argue about these ideas. And we continue to clash the states and the federal national government over power. I have a question for you, and I want you to answer in the chat. Who is more likely to protect liberty? State governments, national governments, or both? What do you think? This response is really similar to my response in my class earlier today. And I want to tell you that there are a few that said federal, there are a few that said both, but most of you said state, just like in my earlier class. And you're wrong. State governments have historically failed to protect liberty. They have historically failed to do that. It has been the national government through the 14th Amendment that has really done that. And so when we talk about that, when we get to civil liberties and we get to civil rights, you're going to see ways that states have consistently used majority rule and the rule of a tyranny of the majority to suppress the rights of individuals. Okay, and we'll definitely talk about that. So we're going to listen to somebody else for a little bit. This is, and I think I'm going to have to change, my share here. So I'm going to stop sharing and then go to it because it froze up in my earlier class. I'm going to hope that it doesn't this time. And I'm going to hope that you're able to see it. Okay, you guys can see?
And standing in front of the Supreme Court
Can't
building,
hear.
where in 2004, 2006, and 2008, the Supreme Court declared that the Bush administration had acted outside the law and had to stop. At issue were policies that Bush had put in place after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Bush had concluded that the United States was engaged in a new kind of war that required a different set of rules. Captured enemy combatants, instead of being tried in regularly constituted courts, would be tried in secret military tribunals. Those that were thought to have important information would be subject to harsh interrogation, including waterboarding, which the United States had condemned as torture when used on American soldiers in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. In one case, the Supreme Court said that the Bush administration had violated the Constitution. In another case, the Supreme Court said that it had violated the laws of Congress and the Geneva Conventions. In its final decision, the Supreme Court rejected the Bush administration's claim that the president alone had authority to decide the rules of law during time of war. That judgment, said the court, belongs to us, the court, not to the president. The Supreme Court in those decisions was acting as the framers of the Constitution would have preferred. In the words of John Adams, the nation's second president, the Constitution was designed to create a government of laws rather than of men. A century after the U.S. Constitution was written, William Gladstone, the four-time Prime Minister of Britain, declared it to be the most wonderful work ever struck off by the brain and purpose of man. Gladstone admired the Constitution for the precedent it set. The nation's highest authority would be the words of a document, rather than the dictates of a top ruler. Today, we take that idea for granted. But in 1787, when the Constitution was written, it was a revolutionary idea. Elsewhere in the world, the law was what the king said it was. His word was law. America would be governed instead by a constitution that put limits on what those in power could do. In this session, we'll look at why the framers of the Constitution were determined to limit the power of government. Then we'll look at how they built the concept of limited government into the Constitution. Finally, we'll examine whether the Constitution has actually served as an effective check on government. The American Revolution was fought to overthrow what the Declaration of Independence called the absolute tyranny of the British king. The framers worried that the U.S. government might itself become tyrannical. It is said that Benjamin Franklin, asked by a woman what type of government the Constitution had created, replied, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." How do you prevent government from becoming tyrannical? You might think it's a constitution that strips government of nearly all power. Some Americans today think that way. A U.S. Senate candidate recently ran on a platform that claimed, "The government which governs best is the government that governs least." The writers of the Constitution knew better, a lesson they had learned the hard way. When the American states declared their independence from Britain, they wrote a constitution called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles established a national government, but gave it almost no authority. It had no power to tax, but instead had to petition the states for money. The states were slow to pay and often paid less than their promised share. During one 5-year period, Georgia and North Carolina paid nothing, not a single dime, to the national treasury. So think about your own finances. What do you do when you're short of cash? Well, for starters, you probably cut back on your spending. You get really desperate, you might try to sell your valuables. Well, that's exactly what the government of the Articles did. To save money, it slashed the Army to less than 1,000 men. To raise money, it sold the Navy ships. This at a time when Britain still had a large army in Canada, and Spain had one in what is now Florida. How would the country defend itself if attacked by Britain or Spain? No wonder that George Washington questioned whether the United States deserved even to be called a nation, and worried that it would descend into chaos, opening the door to a tyrannical leader. Now, the Constitution was meant to fix the defects in the Articles of Confederation, but the writers were also determined that the new government not be so strong as to threaten liberty. So their strategy was to grant the national government necessary powers, including the power to tax, while at the same time placing strict limits on its authority. This strategy included denials of power. Officials would be prohibited, for example, from putting someone in prison and throwing away the keys. This was a common practice at the time in Europe. Opponents of the king were locked away for as long as the king wanted, forever in many cases. That practice would be prohibited in the United States. The Constitution gives the accused the right to appear before a judge who will determine whether authorities have enough evidence to warrant detention. The writers also sought to limit government through grants of power. Article 1 of the Constitution, the very first article of the Constitution, gives Congress 17 specific powers, such as the power to tax, the power to raise an army. These grants give power, but they also deny power. Powers not granted to Congress, those not on the list, are denied it. In a period of history when other governments admitted to no limits on their powers, this was a substantial limitation. As originally written, the U.S. Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights, a list of specific individual rights, such as freedom of speech. The framers thought a list was unnecessary because government had only those powers granted to it, and it had not been granted the power to deny people their rights. Thomas Jefferson was among the many who thought otherwise. Jefferson had included a Bill of Rights in the Virginia Constitution he wrote at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, and other states had followed his example. Said Jefferson, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth." In response to such objections, the first Congress passed a series of amendments that were quickly ratified by the states. These amendments, the first 10 to the Constitution, are called the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is a clear example of limited government. If you were arrested tomorrow and had no money, the judge doesn't have the option of saying, "Tough luck, buddy." The government is required by the Sixth Amendment to provide you a lawyer and to pay for it. Now, the framers didn't think that words alone, written grants and denials, would be enough to control those in power. They wanted something stronger. That something was to divide the government into separate branches and pit them against each other. This was not a new idea. The French theorist Montesquieu had proposed it nearly a half a century earlier. Where there is no separation of powers, he wrote, there can be no liberty. But the framers gave Montesquieu's idea a new twist. Rather than completely separating the branches, as he had proposed, they overlapped them so that each was better positioned to act as a check on the others. So instead of granting all legislative power to Congress, they gave some of it to the president, for example, the power to veto laws, and some of it to the courts, the power to interpret laws. The same with executive power. The president has most of it, but not all of it. For example, Congress controls how much money the president can spend and on what. The president doesn't have the option of taking money allocated for highways and spending it on the military. The same with judicial power. For example, by giving the president the power to nominate federal judges and the Senate the power to confirm them. This system of divided power was described by Harvard's Richard Newstead as one of separated institutions sharing power. The powers of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, are granted to separate branches, but no branch has all power within its sphere of authority. Part of it, in every case, is shared with the other two branches, providing them a means of checking that branch's power. So that's the theory, each branch acting as a check on the others. Now, as you know, theory and reality aren't always the same thing. The English poet John Wilmot quipped, "Before I got married, I had 6 theories about raising children. Now I have 6 children and no theories." What about the framers' theory? Well, the record's far from perfect. After Japan attacked U.S. forces at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered the forced relocation of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast, saying they might try to help the enemy. They were forced to sell their homes at rock-bottom prices and were shipped to detention camps in Utah and other inland states. They lived out the war behind barbed wire, watched over by armed guards. Their advocates looked to Congress for help. Instead, Congress embraced Roosevelt's policy. Not a single senator or House member voted to rescind it. 3 times, the Supreme Court reviewed the policy. Each time, it upheld it, though it was clearly unconstitutional. Racism played into the relocation policy. America had a long history of discriminating against Asians. Chinese were blocked from entry in 1883. Japanese immigration was effectively blocked in 1907. When the survivors of the Titanic arrived by rescue ship in New York Harbor in 1912, they were taken ashore, except for a handful of Chinese crewmen. They were not allowed to set foot on American soil. Ironically, Japanese Americans were allowed during World War II to volunteer for combat in Europe. They made up the entirety of the U.S. Army's 442nd Regiment. That regiment became the most decorated combat unit of its size, not only in World War II, but in the whole of U.S. military history. 21 of its soldiers received the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award. In 1988, the United States issued a formal apology for its mistreatment of Japanese Americans, saying it was the result of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. As the relocation policy indicates, America is not a stranger to tyranny, the powerful trampling on the rights of the weak. Such episodes, however, are relatively few in number, and the system of checks and balances is a reason. Scores of times, the President, Congress, or the Supreme Court has intervened when another branch has overstepped its constitutional authority. The Watergate scandal is a textbook example. On a June night in 1972, a security guard at the Watergate buildings in Washington, D.C., noticed that the latch on the door to the Democratic Party's national headquarters had been taped open. He removed the tape and went away. Coming back later, he noticed the door had been taped open again. He called police. They caught 5 men inside, installing bugs in the phones and ceilings. As it turned out, they had links to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. Nixon denied that anyone at the White House had knowledge of the break-in. In truth, the Watergate break-in was part of a much larger dirty tricks campaign aimed at guaranteeing Nixon's re-election. The dirty tricks included wiretaps, tax audits, burglaries of Nixon opponents, paid in part with money laundered illegally through Mexico. A turning point occurred when, during a Senate investigative hearing, a White House assistant revealed that Nixon had tape recorded all his Oval Office conversations. Nixon at first refused Congress's demand to hear the tapes. As the pressure mounted, he released transcripts of what he claimed were all the relevant ones. When Congress demanded more tape material, Nixon refused. Congress then filed suit to get the tapes. In a unanimous decision, the U.S. Supreme Court, which included 4 Nixon appointees, ordered Nixon to turn over the tapes. They were incriminating. Nixon was heard telling his assistants to cover up the Watergate break-in, including using the CIA to block the FBI from investigating it. With that, the House of Representatives began impeachment hearings. At that point, Nixon resigned, the first and only president to do so. President Nixon, despite holding what is often called the most powerful office on earth, was powerless to stop Congress and the Supreme Court from acting. The writers of the Constitution had established them as separate and independent branches of government, and they acted in precisely that way. Now, as I'm sure you recognize, America's system of checks and balances doesn't always operate that decisively. Politics is a rough and sometimes deceitful game. What if the Watergate burglars had not been so stupid as to get caught? Would Nixon's illegal action have been discovered in time to do anything meaningful about it? Presidential secrecy is one of the major threats to the effectiveness of America's system of checks and balances. Congressional secrecy is not a problem. Congress has 535 members, and it couldn't keep a secret if it tried. The presidency is different. Presidents have the loyalty of their assistants and can sometimes withhold potentially damaging information, as occurred during the impeachment of President Donald Trump. During the inquiry, Trump refused to let White House officials testify at House hearings and blocked them from turning over documents to House investigators. Now, a different type of threat to limited government is illustrated by the federal government's detention of Japanese Americans during World War II. In that case, all three branches thought a breach of the Constitution served the nation's interests in time of war. There's another threat that has shown itself to be important. It can be seen in a situation we discussed earlier, the Bush administration's anti-terrorism policies. As mentioned, the September 11 terrorist attacks convinced the Bush administration that the war on terrorism required a new set of rules. The rules for handling enemy captives were hatched in secrecy to keep them from scrutiny by Congress. They were also kept secret from those in the administration, including Secretary of State and former Army General Colin Powell, who would have objected. Slowly, information about the policies leaked out, in some instances through news stories, in other instances through legal cases being argued in federal courts. As the information came out, there were calls for congressional hearings, but almost none were held. Even the Supreme Court rulings in 2004 and 2006 against Bush administration policies did not prompt Congress to launch high-profile hearings. Then, in 2007, the number of congressional hearings increased dramatically. Why was that? Why was Congress initially slow to scrutinize Bush policies, but then suddenly eager to do so? As you might have guessed, the answer is partisanship. Through 2006, Republicans controlled the House and the Senate, and thereby controlled the scheduling of hearings. They were not at all interested in holding a Republican administration to account for its policies, knowing that it would hurt their party. Things changed abruptly after Democrats swept the 2006 congressional elections and took control of the House and Senate in early 2007. Democrats now controlled the hearing process, and they called one hearing after another. Seeking partisan advantage, they were keen to grill the Bush administration on its war policies. That situation arose again in 2019. During the previous 2 years, when Republicans controlled the House of Representatives, Russia's effort to tip the 2016 presidential election in Donald Trump's favor was the subject of relatively few hearings, and the issue of the Trump campaign's contacts with the Russians was the subject of even fewer. But when Democrats took control of the House in 2019, the number of hearings multiplied, and the inquiries probed more deeply, including whether the president had unlawfully tried to obstruct the Russia investigation. Okay, let's wrap up what we've said in this session. As we noted, the Constitution was designed in part to provide for limited government, meaning a government not so powerful as to threaten liberty. The Constitution contains various controls on government, including grants of power and denials of power. However, the key mechanism is the separation of powers between the three branches, the executive, the legislature, and the judicial. The powers of the branches are overlapped so that each branch can more effectively act as a check on the others. The system doesn't always work as intended. It weakens when, as in the World War II relocation policy, the three branches are united in thinking that the national interest is served by ignoring the Constitution. It weakens when a president succeeds, even for a time, to keep unlawful actions secret. And it weakens when the presidency and Congress are controlled by the same party. Then the majority party in Congress might seek to play down the issue. Although the U.S. system is not a perfect check on power, the record also shows that on many occasions, dozens and dozens of them, it has helped to rein in abuses of power. We'll never know, of course, how U.S. history would have differed if the Constitution had not been based on a system of checks and balances. But the fact that some leaders have tried to operate outside the law suggests they would have done so more readily and more outrageously if the other branches had been powerless to check their actions. There was a great deal of wisdom in what John Adams said in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. I say that power must never be trusted without a check.
Okay, so I am going back and I am sharing, kind of looking here really quickly at the chat if there's
Nothing of substance.
nothing of substance. Okay, all right. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that in his sum up there, and this kind of goes to the questions that you have, whenever he talks about what the limits on governmental power are, he doesn't say the Bill of Rights in that sum up, but it was one of his 4. So be sure to include that in terms of limits on government, and then threats to that limit, there were 3. So 4 and 3. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go back to the lecture. And I'm going to ask a poll question. What limits on government do you believe to be most important? I have activated that poll. And so you have 2 minutes right now to answer that question. So which limit on government is most important to you? Denials of power to government, grants of power to government, the Bill of Rights, or separated institutions sharing power. And if you'll notice, that also answers the first part of that last question. What are the limits to government? What are the threats? Presidential secrecy, partisanship, and whenever all 3 branches believe something is in the national interest, right? Those were those 3 threats to limits on government power. Okay. You guys are doing pretty good on the poll. It looks like 167 of you have now weighed in. So I'm going to go back to your homepage here for your class, and I'm going to remind you of important things, okay? 1, depending on where your fellow wants your workbook, they may want you to bring it to lab, which is great, but they may want you to turn it in. I have fixed all the submissions so that you can turn in chapters 2 and 3 by this Friday if you have to. Remember, in lab, which you have to go to, or you have to contact your fellow if there is a problem that you cannot attend, you still need to turn in chapters 2 and 3. Remember, you're going physically to lab on Friday. You also have in a week and 2 days, the thesis for Killers or Invisible Man. And if you open this up, people have complained a little bit about the fact that there's nothing there. I'm going to add a little content, but if you want to know what you're doing on this assignment as a whole, look at the project as a whole, right? And you're going to choose one of these 3 prompts. If you're reading Killers, you're going to choose one of these 2 prompts. If you're reading Invisible Man, and this is due in a week and 2 days. People are asking me, should I maybe read the book before I come up with the thesis? Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So you might try to read at least most of the book or have a really good idea about which prompt you want to choose, right, by this weekend. And so that by Friday, you can, write that thesis. It's due at midnight. These books are actually, people really, really like them, both of them. I've had a lot of good response on that. I think you'll enjoy them. Back to home again, as a reminder, Zoom link is here, class recordings are here, modules, as a reminder, there's the readings for your class. So this week you've read Federalist 10 and 51, and you may have read the summary and analysis of 10 and 51, which is fine. I put them up there for a reason. Speech of Patrick Henry, Federalist 1. Remember, you have to read the U.S. Constitution before you go to your lab on Friday. You have to read the Constitution because you're going to be dealing with the Constitution and creating your own. So think about it. Chapter 2 workbook and Chapter 3 workbook are here in case you don't have yours yet. The lectures and the question forums are also here. Here's next week's workbook already ready for you. So If you have any questions, please stay on and ask me those questions. But until then, for the rest of you, Boomer. Oh, 2 and 3 in Cengage are both due on Monday before class. Be sure to do them. Boomer.